I would like to begin my analysis of the Prose of the World alongside another text, C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, an introduction to medieval literature. And the reason I'd like to begin here is because Lewis and Foucault are attempting something similar. They're inviting us to enter into the consciousness of our forefathers and to ask at a given time what made their experience possible. Foucault's concern is with knowledge and language, and Lewis's is with literature. That we've discarded an image of the world that we previously had, a model of the world. You see, for Lewis, in order to understand medieval literature, we must restore that model of thought and of visibility, to see things not as moderns, but as medievals. Hence, why Lewis asks us to take a hike on a starry night and to look up at the stars, rather than out at the stars. Because in the medieval period, the image that dominated people's mind was that the earth was flat, that the sun revolved around the earth, that nighttime was the shutting of an eyelid, a finger passing over the sun, causing its shadow over the earth. Where we look through darkness and past it, we can imagine that the medievals were looking at darkness itself. The universe and the heavens, past Earth's shadow, were always illuminated. There are literary passages of a starry night that is never silent, for it pulsates with the trumpets and violins of God. Do not fear in the emptiness of night. God is always here. God was immanent and luminous in everything. These are the causal reasons behind everything. The celestial spheres and angels, who are the stars, are conscious and moved by the love of God, by a sympathy between them that exhibits its force through an ether which permeates through the universe. Chaucer, in the House of Fame, writes that every kindly thing that is, hath a kindly steed that are he, may best in hit conserved be, unto which place everything, through his kindly inclining, moveth for to come to. In his analysis of heterotopias, Foucault says, in the Middle Ages, there was a hierarchic ensemble of places, sacred places and profound places, protected places and open, exposed places, urban places and rural places. All these concern the real life of men. In cosmological theory, there were the super-celestial places as opposed to the celestial, and the celestial place was in its turn opposed to the terrestrial place. There were places where things had been put because they had been violently displaced, and then, on the contrary, places where things found their natural ground and stability. It was this complete hierarchy, this opposition, this intersection of places that constituted what could be very roughly be called the medieval space, the space of emplacement. Everything has a definite place, and a place accorded to it by something else, and everything links together like a chain, but not in a flat equality, rather like a hierarchical ladder. One looks up at the Almighty after all, up at the stars. Foucault says aptly that the universe was folded in upon itself. The earth, echoing the sky, faces seeing themselves reflected in the stars, and the plants, holding within their stems the secrets that were of use to man. Painting imitated space, and representation, whether in the service of pleasure or of knowledge, was posited as a form of repetition, the theater of life or the mirror of nature. That was the claim made by all language, its matter of declaring its existence and formulating its right of speech. And to illustrate this point further, let us recall a quote from Magie Naturelle. As respect to its vegetation, the plant stands convenient to the brute beast. So through feeling does the brutish animal to man, who is comfortable to the rest of the stars by his intelligence. These links proceed so strictly that they appear as a rope stretched from the first, because as far as the lowest and smallest of things, by reciprocal and continuous connection, in such wise that the superior virtue, spread its beams, reaches so far that if we touch one extremity of that cord, it will make tremble and move all of the rest. The elementary force that holds things together in the mind of the medieval is what C.S. Lewis calls the principle of the Triad. That is, that there is nothing internal to an object that brings it into connection with another object, but rather that there is a force that is external, which brings things together. The clearest statement is from Plato himself. It is impossible that two things only should be joined together without a third. There must be some bond between both to bring them together. What Lewis will contend in The Discarded Image is that the medieval mindset is riddled with the scraps of antiquity philosophy and paganism, developing its own flavor of Neoplatonism. In Plato's Symposium, it is at least insinuated that God never meets man directly. They speak to him through a medium, that is to say, that they never encounter each other directly. Between reason and appetite, soul and body, kings and commons, Plato and the medievals are going to be forming bridges between things like a chain. Something which I'd like to send home quite early in this lecture is the position of man in the medieval image. We are working our way through the order of things, no doubt to discover man's birth and to witness his disappearance. In medieval cosmology, man is on the margins, while Earth is at the center of the universe, because it is of convenience and of aesthetic pleasure, not to us, but to the angels and celestial beings which dance around it, to quote Lewis. Thus, for Chalcidius, who's a sort of proto-medieval cosmologist, the geocentric universe is not in the least anthropocentric. If we ask why, nevertheless, the Earth is central, he has a very unexpected answer. It is placed in such an order that the celestial dance may have a center to revolve around. In fact, as an aesthetic convenience for celestial beings. And later, he says, Alanus ab Insulis compares this model of the universe to a city. In the central castle, in the Empyrean, the emperor, God, sits enthroned. In the lower heavens live the angelic knighthood. We, on earth, are outside the city wall. How then can the Empyrean be the center when it is not only on, but outside their circumference of the whole universe? Because, as Dante was to say more clearly than anyone else, this spatial order is the opposite of the spiritual, and the material cosmos mirrors, hence reverses, the reality, so that what is truly the rim seems to us the hub. That is to say that we watch the spectacle of the celestial dance, according to Chalcidius, but from the outskirts. The medieval image is anthroperipheral. I should liken this to Chiggy's dome. In fact, if I were forced to leave you with a single image of the medieval episteme, I should like to depart with you this one, because I feel as though it not only encapsulates the medieval disposition, but also the contents of this lecture. We see in the center God, around him the purest angels reaching for his presence. On the outskirts, separated by individual frames, we see the archangels who represent the spheres. In each of their respective frames, the angels move and recite their virtues, but each one looks towards God and gestures to his body as though they are being pulled. This is the super celestial emplacement. It is a wheel with God at its hub. Outside the gates of the city, it is to the boundary of the wheel that man belongs, but we are also its center, for it is the gaze of God that cuts across the boundary and fixes our attention. We are his subject, and he is ours. The pull on one another is through a practice of power fixed by sympathy, the kindly inclining of Chaucer. This is the inversion of the heavens described by Dante. It is at the point of inversion where man, made in the image of God, encounters himself both as mere resemblance and as a privileged point of intent. This is the mirror where man encounters himself and his double, sees himself reflected across the universe, but also utterly peripheral to its state of being. It is here where we are reminded of the anguish of Maldoror, of the joke of human existence, to be nothing but resemblance, a poor imitation of God, to have no power over one's destiny. As Lewis says, all this time we are describing the universe spread out in space, dignity, power, and speed, progressively diminishing as we descend from its circumference to its center, the Earth. But I have already hinted that the intelligible universe reverses it all. The Earth is the rim, the outside edge where it begins to fade away on the border of nonentity. A few astonishing lines from the Paradiso stamp this on the mind forever. There, Dante sees God as a point of light. 7 concentric rings of light revolve around that point, and that which is smallest and nearest to it has the swiftest movement. Chalcidius likewise envisioned that the utility of sight was for that of philosophy, for seeing God, for the mystery and curiosity provided by them beget spirituality. No man would seek God nor aspire to piety unless he had first seen the sky and the stars. God gave men eyes in order that they might observe the wheeling movements of mind and providence in the sky. The utility of hearing was likewise for the sake of music, the operations of the soul related to rhymes and modes. In music, we are brought closer to God. The medieval disposition was predicated on the notion of finitude, inherited from Plato, and therefore by an absolute up and down and an inherent shape to the universe. Earth, at both the center and the outside of the model, was always the universe's lowest point. Movement to it is always a movement downward. Our experience of distance must be abandoned in lieu of that less analogous sense of height. Height, which speaks immediately to our muscles and our nerves, while the perceived height of the stars is, to the medieval experience, something relatively small when placed next to the scientific description of the present. This is, however, of little importance. In the realm of thought and imagination, 10 million miles and 1,000 miles are much the same. When us moderns look out upon the night sky, it is the same as looking upon an ocean which disappears into the mist. To look up at the towering medieval universe is analogous to the experience of looking up at a great building. What Lewis asks of us is that to understand medieval literature, we must first understand the medieval disposition. You see, likewise, Foucault wants us to always look at history at one and the same time from a position of neutrality and from the perspective of our ancestors. Lewis says that, I am only suggesting considerations that may induce us to regard all models in the right way, respecting each and idolizing none. We are all, very properly, familiar with the idea that in every age the human mind is deeply influenced by the accepted model of the universe. But there is a two-way traffic. The model is also influenced by the prevailing temper of mind. And I think Foucault would agree with this as well. But in any case, Foucault wants to ask, what is the logic that sustains this experience, this model of the universe? How did the medieval person arrange and order the universe in such a way that it divulges its truth to the senses? Up to the 16th century, it was resemblance that played the constructive role in Western knowledge. In Foucault's work on René Magritte, entitled This Is Not a Pipe, he defines resemblance by a series of principles. First principle, that by resemblance we demonstrate and speak across differences. The two systems can neither merge nor intersect. In one way or another, subordination is required. The second principle, which rules resemblance, posits an equivalence between the fact of resemblance and an affirmation between a representative bond. That is to say, that within the resemblance of two objects, there is both a hierarchy and a representation which acknowledges something. It affirms. To put simply, imagine two twins. I can say there is a visible resemblance on the exteriority between the two. When I say one of the twins resembles another, I'm forming a hierarchy between an original and a duplicate. When I say this resemblance affirms the conception of twins as a form of existence, of being, I'm practicing the logic of resemblance. Foucault says, resemblance has a model, an original element that orders and arranges a hierarchy from the increasingly less faithful copies that can be struck from it. Resemblance presupposes a primary reference that prescribes in classes. Similitude On the other hand, is the practice of seeing resemblance in a series that can equally proceed in two directions. That is to say, that it can start from the beginning or end, travel to the center, and always remain the same. Simultudes are doubles, the mirror image which reflects to infinity. Foucault continues, the similar develops in series that have neither beginning nor end, that can be followed in one direction as easily as in another, that obey no hierarchy, but propagate themselves from small differences. Resemblance serves representation, which rules over it. Similitude serves repetition, which ranges across it. Resemblance predicates itself upon a model it must return to and reveal. Similitude circulates the simulacrum as an indefinite and reversible relation of the similar to the similar. Simulacrum is a field of images whose meanings depend on one another. They've lost their original meaning. Foucault says that it was between resemblance and similitude that Western knowledge constituted itself in the 16th century. In the first chapter of the Prose of the World, Foucault details the four similitudes which he believes are to be the most essential in the medieval episteme, those of conventia, homilatio, analogy, and sympathy. These tell us how the world folds in upon itself. We've already discussed sympathy and the movements of the celestial bodies. This is the kindly inclining that Saussure tells us of. It is the force that makes the great yellow disk of the sunflower turn to follow the curving path of the sun, says Foucault. Lewis remarks, in the medieval science, the fundamental concept was of certain sympathies, antipathies, and strivings inherent in matter itself. For example, in the advancement of learning, Francis Bacon remarks that the iron, in particular sympathy, move to the lodestone. Sympathy, in contrast to the other similitudes, moves in a free state. It can traverse vast distances in an instant, but it can also be experienced by a simple contact. Foucault cites here a text that references the roses one offers to a grave that, because of their adjacency with death, will render all those who come in contact with them sad and moribund. He writes, it excites the things of the world to movement and can draw even the most distant of them together. It is a principle of mobility. It attracts what is heavy to the heaviness of the earth, what is light up towards the weightless ether, the roots of the plants towards water. Sympathy is an instance of the same, so strong and so insistent that it will not rest content to be merely one of the forms of likeness. It has the dangerous power of assimilating, of rendering things identical to one another, of mingling them, of causing their individuality to disappear, and thus rendering them foreign to what they were before. Sympathy transforms, it alters, but in the direction of identity, so that if its power were not counterbalanced, it would reduce the world to a point, to a homogeneous mass, to the featureless form of the same. This is why sympathy is compensated by its twin, antipathy. Antipathy maintains the isolation of things and prevents their assimilation. It encloses every species within its impenetrable difference and its propensity to continue being what it is. We are well aware here of the hatred between plants, of the density of treetops which selfishly leaves the plants at their base in darkness, or of those plants with several roots that drink all the water in the flower bed. Likewise, we are familiar with the cycle of life which draws every animal together through sympathy and turns them into murderers from antipathy. Foucault says, the identities of things, the fact that they can resemble others and be drawn to them, though without being swallowed up or losing their singularity, this is assured by the constant counterbalancing of sympathy and antipathy. It explains how things grow, develop, intermingle, disappear, die, and yet endlessly find themselves again. In short, how there can be space, which is nevertheless not without landmarks or repetitions, not without havens of similitude, and time, which nevertheless allows the same forms, the same species, and the same elements to reappear indefinitely. Resemblance appears, a resemblance that becomes double as soon as one attempts to unravel it. a resemblance of the place, the site upon which nature has placed two things, and thus a similitude of properties. For in this natural container, the world, adjacency is not an exterior relation between things, but the sign of a relation, obscure though it may be. And then, from this contact, by exchange, there arise new resemblances. A common regime becomes necessary. Upon the similitude that was the hidden reason for their propinquity is superimposed a resemblance that is the visible effect of that proximity. Foucault cites the example of body and soul in theology. The body is the place, the site upon which God places the soul. The soul is made dense to be placed inside the body, as opposed to the spirit, which is the soul freed from the body and dispersed in space. The soul requires animation from the movements of the body, and in turn, the body receives the passions of the soul. Things are made convenient for one another, and if I try to unravel one from the other, this convenience becomes doubly apparent. The body, after all, lacks everything the soul possesses, and vice versa. He says, resemblances impose adjacencies that in turn guarantee further resemblances. Place and similitude become entangled. We see mosses growing on the outside of shells, plants in the antlers of stags, a sort of grass on the faces of men, and the strange zoophyte, by mingling together the properties that make it similar to the planets as well as to the animals, also juxtaposes them. The logic of resemblance is an automatically proliferating one, because it is the practice of looking past differences and establishing a similitude between innumerable things. I'd like us to return to a quote presented at the start of this lecture from Magie Naturelle that stated as follows: "The plant stands convenient to the brute beast, so through feeling does the brutish animal to man, who is comfortable to the rest of the stars by his intelligence." And to sum this up again, so plants were replaced for beasts, and man was placed proportionate to beasts and to the heavens by his feelings and by his intelligence. Passions and feelings, these are the wild beasts which man must tame. They are the force which keeps man to the ground, next to the plants and to the beasts. It is his intelligence which brings him closer to God, to the heavens. Now, I'd like to pause here briefly for a moment and return to Lewis, because in the medieval disposition, what we call reason and intelligence signified a different relationship than we're familiar with at the present. Medieval reason denotes either a rational soul or the lower of the two faculties which a rational soul exercises. These are intellectus and reason. Now, intellectus is the higher of the two faculties, so that if we call it understanding, the later Coleridgean distinction, which puts reason above understanding, inverts this traditional order. Now, Boethius distinguishes intelligence from reason, the former being enjoyed in its perfection by angels. Intellectus is that in man which approximates most nearly to angelic intelligence. It is in fact ubumberatio intelligence, cloud intelligence, or shadow of intelligence. Its relation to reason is thus described by Aquinas. Intellect is the simple, i.e. indivisible, uncompounded, grasp of an intelligible truth, whereas reason is the progression towards an intelligible truth going from one understood point to another. The difference between them is like the difference between rest and motion, or between possession and acquisition. That is to say that we are enjoying intellectus when we see self-evident truth, a priori truth. We practice ratio or reason when we proceed step by step to prove a truth which is not self-evident. A cognitive life where all can be seen as self-evident would be the life of an angel. Lewis goes on saying that man's mental life is spent laboriously connecting those frequent but momentary flashes of intelligence which constitute intellectus. Now, let us remember this when we proceed to part 2 of the Prose of the World, because we see how man uses their faculties to decipher the signs and signatures of the world. So, between sympathy and conventia, we see the universe functioning like a chain. The end of one link denotes the beginning of another until everything is bound together. The similitude of amalacia is identical to conventia with a critical difference. Where conventia denotes a force of adjacency, the side by side or superimposed over. Amalacia functions without spatial collusion, prevalent in conventia, and is able to bring together objects by resemblance at a distance. To summarize, Foucault says, there is something in emulation and a reflection in the mirror. It is the means whereby things scattered through the universe can answer one another. We just mentioned that man's higher reason in the medieval image was predicated along a deficiency that regardless resembled the intelligence of angels. It mirrors the intelligence of God. It emulates. This is the force of emulation. The relation of emulation enables things to imitate one another from one end of the universe to another without connection or proximity. By duplicating in a mirror, the world abolishes the distance proper to it. In this way, it overcomes the place allotted to each thing. Contrary to the chain of conventia, the forces of sympathy, amalacia functions like a series of concentric circles, reflecting and rivaling one another. As Crolius says, the stars are the matrix of all the plants, and every star in the sky is the spiritual prefiguration of a plant, such that it represents that plant. And just as each herb or plant is a terrestrial star looking up at a sky, so also each star is a celestial plant in spiritual form. So in accordance with the principle of de-evolution or mediation, the influences do not work upon us directly, but by first modifying the air. As John Donne says in Ecstasy, on man, heaven's influence works not so, but that it first imprints the air. A pestilence is caused originally by maleficial conjunctions of planets, as when kindly heard the conscience and came out of the planet and sent forth his frares, fervors, and fluxes. Piers Plowman. But the bad influence operates by being literally in the air. Hence, when a medieval doctor could give no more particular cause for the patient's condition, he attributed it to this influence which is present in the air. Lastly, analogy are the similtudes that denote the resemblances among systems of relations. The relation of the stars in which they shine may also be the same between the planets and the earth they inhabit, between minerals such as diamonds and the rocks in which they are buried, between sense organs and the face they animate, between skin moles and the body which they are the secret marks. The medieval space is a space of emplacement, where knowledge proceeds by the interplay of hermeneutics and semiology. The visible world is made of an invisible pattern. We have sketched, roughly then, the episteme which hung over Western thought. Its economy of resemblances is both plethoric and poverty-stricken. Plethoric, because every object's place owes itself in turn to other objects which in turn signify other signs. Each symbol, therefore, only has a value insofar as it accounts for all the others. All the signs and signatures must therefore be gathered in order to justify a proposition, to provide an appearance of certainty. Medieval science was thus an accumulation of confirmations, which in turn justify each other. It thus condemned itself to the science of saying the same thing, of repetition. Lewis says, most of those who helped, either by speech or writing, to keep pseudo-zoology in circulation were not really concerned one way or the other with the question of fact. Just as today, the public speaker who warns me not to hide my head like an ostrich is not really thinking and does not want me to think about ostriches. The moral is what matters. You need to know these facts in order to read the poets or take part in polite conversation. Hence, as Bacon said, if an untrue in nature once be afoot, by reason of the use of opinion and similitudes and ornaments of speech, it is never called down. And later, Lewis says, If, as Platoism taught, and the medieval followed, the visible world is made after an invisible pattern, if things below the moon are all derived from things above her, the expectation that an analogical or moral sense will have been built into the nature and behavior of all the creatures would not be a priori unreasonable. To us, an account of animal behavior would seem improbable if it suggested too obvious a moral. Not so to them. Their premises were different. The medieval disposition, its image, is that of the microcosm as the general configuration of nature. It is here we find clearly the genealogical connection of Plato and paganism, and its intersection with Christianity. It is the image of emulation and analogy where terrestrial things find their duplicates in higher dimensions, the macrocosm. But we must not pause here, because if one views this image at the level of the archaeological method, then we are forced to confront ourselves with the question of its possibility, of defining a threshold and setting a limit. It is not because people believed in the dialectics of microcosm and macrocosm that they proceeded to seek out the signatures of the world and discover their latent meanings, but rather that this dialectic provided both the guarantee of relations, their divinity, their divine right, and their limit of expansion, i.e., the boundary of their thought. The fact is that it had one, or rather two, precise functions in the epistemological configuration of this period. As a category of thought, it applies the interplay of duplicated resemblances to all realms of nature. It provides all investigation with an assurance that everything will find its mirror and its macroscopic justification on another and larger scale. It affirms, inversely, that the visible order of the highest spheres will be found reflected in the darkest depths of the earth. But understood as a general configuration of nature, it poses real, and if it were, tangible limits to the indefatigable to and fro of simultudes relieving one another. Lewis remarks, medieval man is a rational animal, and therefore a composite being, partly akin to the angel who are rational, but on the later scholastic view, not animal, and partly akin to beasts, which are animal but not rational. This gives us one of the senses in which he is the literal world or macrocosm. Every mode of being in the whole universe contributes to him. He is the cross-section of being. As Gregory the Great says, it is because man has existence common with stones, life in trees, and understanding with angels. He is rightly called by name of the world. Medieval man, at his most characteristic, was a man of systems and codes. War was formalized through the art of heraldry and the rules of chivalry. Sexual passion, by an elaborate code of conduct. Studies of law and moral theology. Scholasticism. All these things flourish under the duration of the Middle Ages. It is not from an insufficiency of structure that the 16th century knowledge suffers. On the contrary, we have already seen how very meticulous are the configurations that define its space. One might pause, however. How, at this time, did magic, theology, scholasticism, and an appreciation of Neoplatonism all intermingle with one another? But you must recall the limit of the dialectics of microcosm and macrocosm. It guaranteed meaning and the limit which prevents magical signs from wandering away from divinity, from God. Divination is not a real form of knowledge. It is a part of the main body of knowledge itself. There is no difference between the visible marks that God has stamped upon the surface of the earth so that we may know its inner secrets, and the legible words that the scriptures or the sages of antiquity have set down in the books preserved for us by tradition. The value of language lay in the fact that it was a sign of things. Thus, the relation of these texts, scripture and philosophical, is of the same nature as the relation to things. In both cases, there are the signs that must be discovered. But God, in order to exercise our wisdom, merely sowed nature with forms for us to decipher, and it is in this sense that knowledge should be divinatio, whereas the ancients have already provided us with interpretations, which we need do no more than gather together, or which we would need only to gather together, were it not for the necessity of learning their language, reading their texts, and understanding what they have said. The heritage of antiquity, like nature itself, is a vast space requiring interpretation. In both cases, there are signs to be discovered and then, little by little, made to speak. In other words, divinatio and eruditio are both part of the same hermeneutics. Magic permitted the decipherment of the world by revealing the secret resemblances beneath things. Its value and force derived from the form of similitude which found its power in sympathy. The truth of all these marks, whether they are woven in nature itself or whether they exist in lines on parchments and in libraries, is everywhere the same, coeval with the institution of God. So in the medieval episteme, language itself, as humans have practiced it, is but another mark in the universe, another identity which in itself bears some secret, is subject to the forces of sympathy and microcosm. Words are pulled together in their essence, their original, which they are like the bad copies of. Words in their pure state are opaque. They are what they claim to be, a disposition in which it was axiomatic that all perfect things precede all imperfect things, referring to Boethius and Plato here. Language is not a bunch of independent signs. It is subject to the same experience as the plants, the herbs, the stones, and the animals. Language itself partakes in the dissemination of similitudes and signatures and must therefore be studied as a thing of nature. Language is not what it is because it has meaning. Its representative content was of no importance. Words group syllables together and syllables letters because there are virtues placed in individual letters that draw them towards each other or keep them apart, exactly as the marks found in nature also repel or attract one another. The first archaeological conclusion that Foucault will come to is as follows. The study of grammar in the 16th century is based upon the same epistemological arrangement as the science of nature or the esoteric disciplines. The only differences are that there is only one nature and there are several languages, and that in the esoteric field, the properties of words, syllables, and letters are discovered by another discourse, which always remains secret, whereas in grammar, it is the words and phrases of everyday life that themselves express their properties. Language stands halfway between the visible forms of nature and the secret conveniences of esoteric discourse. It is a fragmented nature, divided against itself and deprived of its original transparency by admixture. It is a secret that carries within itself, though near the surface, the decipherable sides of what it is trying to say. It is at the same time a buried revelation, and a revelation that is gradually being restored to ever greater clarity. And later, the primacy of the written word in the study of language sets the conditions for esotericism. It was the primal nature of language to be written. The sounds made by voices provide no more than a transitory and precarious translation of it. What God introduced into the world was written, placed on things like marks, as signs. Thus it was the task of medieval scholasticism to unearth these exterior and visible signs in order to reify the whole knowledge of God and its similarities, not only in nature, but also in language, antiquity, alchemy, magic, etc. Now, Adam, when he imposed the first names upon the animals, did no more than read those visible and silent marks. The law was entrusted to the tablets, not to men's memories. And it is in a book that the true word must be found again. Vigenère and Drouot both said, in almost identical terms, that the written word had always preceded the spoken, certainly in nature and perhaps even in the knowledge of men. For it was very possible that before Babel, before the flood, there had already existed a form of writing composed of the marks of nature itself, with the result that its characters would have the power to act upon things directly, to attract them or repel them, to represent their properties, their virtues, and their secrets. A primitively natural writing, and of which certain forms of esoteric knowledge and the Kabbalah, first and foremost, may perhaps have preserved the scattered memory and were now attempting to retrieve its long dormant powers. Esotericism in the 16th century is a phenomenon of the written word, not the spoken word. At all events, the later is stripped of its powers. It is merely the female part of language. Vigenère and Drouot tells us, just as its intellect is passive, writing, on the other hand, is the active intellect, the male principle of language. It alone harbors the truth. Remember, the high intellect bears sympathy to God. It pulls us closer to them. The lower intellect is those of the beast. It bears sympathy to the terrestrial beings. Now, but though language no longer bears an immediate resemblance to the things it names, this does not mean that it is separate from the world. It still continues in another form to be the locus of revelation and to be included in the area where truth is both manifested and expressed. True, it is no longer nature in its primal visibility, but neither is it the mysterious instrument with powers known only to a few privileged persons. It is rather the figuration of a world redeeming itself, lending its ear at last to the true word. This is why it was God's wish that Latin, the language of his church, should spread over the whole terrestrial globe. And it is also why all the languages of the world, as it became possible to know them through this conquest, make up together the image of the truth. As Claude Duret points out, like the sunflower, languages follow the path of the heavens. If written from right to left, following the course and daily movement of the first heaven, which is most perfect and tending towards unity according to Aristotle, those who write from left to right are following the course and movement of the second heaven, home of the 7 planets. Those who write from top to bottom in conformity with the order of nature, which has given men heads at the tops of their body and feet at the bottom. In opposition to the aforehand mentioned, the Mexicans write either from bottom to top or else in spiral lines, such as those made by the sun and its annual journey through the zodiac. All the languages had their place. There, they reflected the heavens. In their places, they were operated by the forces of the strongest simultudes. The relation of languages to the world is one of analogy rather than of signification, or rather, their value as signs and their duplicating function are superimposed. They speak the heaven and the earth of which they are the image. They reproduce in their most material architecture the cross, whose coming they announce, that coming which establishes its existence in its own turn through the scriptures and the word. Language possesses a symbolic function, but since the disaster at Babel, we must no longer seek for it. The rare exceptions in the words themselves, but rather in the very existence of language, in its total relation to the totality of the world, in the intersecting of its space with the loci and the forms of the cosmos. Hence, the form of the Encyclopedia Project as it appears at the end of the 16th century or in the first years of the 17th, not to reflect what one knows in the neutral element of language, the use of the alphabet as an arbitrary but efficacious encyclopedia order, does not appear until the second half of the 17th century, but to reconstitute the very order of the universe by the way in which words are linked together and arranged in space. It is this project that we find in Gregor and Alcidius's Encyclopedia, who contrives to spatialize acquired knowledge both in accordance with the cosmic, unchanging, and perfect form of the circle, and in accordance with the sublunary, perishable, multiple, and divided form of the tree. It is also to be found in the work of Lacroix de Maid, who envisages a space that would be at once an encyclopedia and a library, and would permit the arrangement of written texts according to the forms of adjacency, kinship, analogy, and subordination prescribed by the world itself. But in any case, such an interweaving of language and things in a space common to both presupposes an absolute privilege on the part of writing. Foucault notes that Buffon, not long after Aldrovandi, expressed amazement that such a monumental naturalist would place fables next to anatomy, a hodgepodge of myth, natural history, and esotericism. In fact, Buffon comments, "Let it be judged, after that which proportion of natural history is to be found in such a hodgepodge of writing. There is no description here, only legends." And indeed, for Aldrovandi and his contemporaries, it was all legend, things to be read. But the reason for this was not that they preferred the authority of men to the precision of an unprejudiced eye, but that nature, in itself, is an unbroken tissue of words and signs, of accounts and characters, of discourse and forms. When one is faced with the task of writing an animal's history, it is useless and impossible to choose between the profession of naturalist and that of compiler. One has to collect together into one and the same form of knowledge all that has been seen and heard, all that has been recounted either by nature or by men, by the language of the world, by tradition or by the poets. To know an animal or a plant or any terrestrial thing, whatever, is to gather together the whole dense layer of science with which it or they may have been covered. It is to discover all the constellations of forms from which they derive their value as heraldic signs. Aldrovandi was neither a better nor a worse observer than Buffon. He was neither more credulous than he, nor less attached to the fullness of the observing eye or to the rationality of things. His observation was simply not linked to things in accordance with the same system, or by the same arrangement of the episteme. For Aldrovandi was meticulously contemplating a nature which was, from top to bottom, written. Knowledge, therefore, consisted in relating one form of language to another form of language, and restoring the great unbroken plane of words and things, and making everything speak. That is, in bringing into being, at a level above that of all marks, the secondary discourse of commentary. The function proper to knowledge is not seeing or demonstrating. It is interpreting. Scriptural commentary, commentaries of ancient authors, commentaries on the accounts of travelers, commentaries on legends and fables. None of these forms of discourse is required to justify its claim to be expressing a truth before it is interpreted. All that is required of it is the possibility of talking about it. Language contains its own inner principle of proliferation. The task of commentary can never, by definition, be completed, and yet commentary is directed entirely towards the enigmatic, murmured element of the language being commented on. It calls into being, below the existing discourse, another discourse that is more fundamental and, as it were, more primal, which it sets itself the task of restoring. There can be no commentary unless, below the language, one is reading and deciphering. There runs the sovereignty of an original text, and it is this text which, by providing a foundation for commentary, offers its ultimate revelation as the promised reward of commentary. The necessary proliferation of the exegesis is therefore measured, ideally limited, and yet ceaselessly animated by this silent dominion. The language of the 16th century, understood not as an episode in the history of any one tongue, but as a global cultural experience, found itself caught, no doubt, between these interacting elements in the interstice occurring between the primal text and the infinity of interpretation. One speaks upon the basis of a writing that is part of the fabric of the world. One speaks about it to infinity, and each of its signs becomes in turn written matter for further discourse. But each of these stages of discourse is addressed to that primal written word whose return it simultaneously promises and postpones. It will be seen that the experience of language belongs to the same archaeological network as the knowledge of things in nature. To know those things was to bring to light the system of resemblances that made them close to and dependent upon one another, but one could discover the similitudes between them only insofar as there existed, on their surface, a totality of signs forming the text of an unequivocal message. But then, these signs themselves were no more than a play of resemblances, and they referred back to the infinite and necessary uncompleted task of knowing what is similar. In the same way, though the analogy is inverted, language sets itself the task of restoring an absolutely primal discourse, but it can express that discourse only by trying to approximate it, by attempting to say things about it that are similar to it, thereby bringing into existence the infinity of adjacent and similar fidelities of interpretation. The commentary expresses endlessly that which it is commenting upon, and which it can never express. Just as the knowledge of nature constantly finds new signs for resemblance because resemblance cannot be known in itself, even though the signs can never be anything but similtudes. And just as the infinite play within nature finds its link, its form, and its limitation in the relation of the microcosm to the macrocosm, so does the infinite task of commentary derive its strength from the promise of an effectively written text, which interpretation will one day reveal in its entirety. Now, on this note, I'd like to return to Lewis and discuss a humorous but adjacent observation on the medieval experience. So many of the great stories which we hold today as monuments to our past are really completely banal. There are so many familiar morals, tropes, and arcs. It's easy to see, at least in the experience of literature, the tendency for the medieval to not only say the same thing, but who would be quite happy to say the same thing for infinity. In lieu of banality and scarcity of original thought, Lewis remarks that it would have been impossible for men to work in this way if they had anything like our conception of literary property. But it would also have been impossible unless their idea of literature had differed from ours on a deeper level. Far from feigning originality as a modern plagiarist would, they were apt to conceal it. They sometimes profess to be serving something from Akshur at the very moment when they are departing from him. For the aim is not self-expression or creation. It is to hand on the historical matter worthily, not worthily of our own genius or of the poetic art, but of the matter itself. And he continues later, I doubt if they would have understood our demand for originality or valued the work in their own age, which was original, any more on that account. If you ask Chasseur, why do you not make up a brand new story of your own? I think they would have replied, surely we are not reduced to that. Spin something out of one's own head when the world teems with so many noble deeds, wholesome examples, pitiful tragedies, strange adventures, and merry jests, which have never yet been set forth quite so well as they deserve? The originality which we regard as a sign of wealth might seem to them as a confession of poverty. Why make things for oneself like the lonely Robinson Crusoe when there is riches all about the world to be had for the taking? The modern artist often does not think the riches are there. He is the alchemist who must turn base metal into gold. It makes a radical difference. So, writing in the medieval period through the Renaissance was, as we have seen already, composed by the principle of the Triad, as all things are. Signs were organized in a threefold system: the marks themselves, the things designated by those marks, and the simultudes that join them together. That is to say that resemblance constituted both the form and the content of the sign, and thus the three elements operated as a unitary whole. However, during the 17th century, things changed. In the words of Bachelard, there was an epistemological rupture at the foundation of the episteme. The epistemological obstacles which prevented difference and organized the same were freed. The world was no longer seen as itself a depository of language and meaning. Inaugurated by the monumental dissemination of the Port Royal grammar, language was wrestled free of things and entered into an arbitrary relation to things as representation. What was to disappear from Western knowledge was the medieval arrangement, and together with the interplay it authorizes, is found also, though inverted, in the experience of language. In fact, language exists, first of all, in its raw and primitive being, in the simple material form of writing, a stigma upon things, a mark imprinted across the world, which is a part of its most ineffaceable forms. In a sense, this layer of language is unique and absolute, but it also gives rise to two other forms of discourse which provide it with a frame. Above it, there is commentary, which recasts the given signs to serve a new purpose, and below it, the text, whose primacy is presupposed by commentary to exist hidden beneath the marks visible to all. Hence, there are three levels of language, all based upon the single being of the written word. So this is what disappeared with the rupture of the Renaissance. The primacy of the written word went into abeyance, and that uniform layer in which the seen and the read, the visible and the expressible, were endlessly interwoven and vanished as well. Things and words were to be separated from one another. The medieval question of how it was possible to know that mark did in fact designate what it signified by either genesis or similitude. A system of resemblances was replaced with the question, how could a sign be linked to what it signified? What was the proper mode of representation? A question to which the classical period was to reply by the analysis of representation, and to which modern thought was to reply by the analysis of meaning and signification. Now, that is to say that language was never to be anything more than a particular case of representation for the classics, or of signification for us. This represents that. Verse, this indicates that. They belong to one another. The profound kinship of language with the world experience in the medieval disposition was thus dissolved. So what Foucault is trying to do is articulate a history of order, how things were arranged so that truth could reveal itself to the senses, be ingested, and in return reiterated its truth. What are the conditions of truth? How do they function at a particular time and at a given place? This is what the archaeological method at the level of history and of knowledge concerned itself with. We've already seen one system of order predicated on an arrangement of systems of resemblances, one which we are leaving behind now for an order predicated on representation. However, we'd be wrong to say that there is no crossover between our time and the classics or the medieval. These ruptures are not absolute. As much as some dim-witted commentators may suggest, Foucault does not want to dispute the continuity of thought, but rather what is held as novelty. Of course, there is still a power and resemblance in classical representation, but they are novel versions of the former power that discourse granted them, dissipated and more dispersed, relegated to particular elements in space. There are still fundamental questions of how things change, why they change, and how it is they change so rapidly. Problems Foucault is keen to, but neither consistently nor transparently addresses, but alludes to in the Archaeology of Knowledge. C.S. Lewis, on the other hand, remarks here that neither theological prejudice nor vested interests can permanently keep in favor a model which is seen to be grossly uneconomical. The new astronomy triumphed, not because the case of the old became desperate, but because the new one was a better tool. Critically, and like Foucault, Lewis notes the change of models did not involve astronomy alone. It involved also, in biology, the change, arguably more important, from de-evolution to an evolution scheme, from a cosmology in which it was axiomatic, all things precede all imperfect thing, to one in which it was axiomatic that the starting point is always lower than what is developed. The degree of change can be gauged by the fact that primitive is now in most contexts a pejorative term. And he says later, there is no question here of the old models being shattered by the inrush of new phenomena. The truth would seem to be the reverse, that when changes in the human mind produce a sufficient disestablishment of the old model and a sufficient hankering for some new one, phenomena to support the new one will obediently turn up. I do not mean at all that these new phenomena are illusory. Nature has all sorts of phenomena on stock and can suit many different tastes. And he continues later. Nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions we ask her. Here, as in the courts, the character of evidence depends upon the shape of the examination, and a good cross-examiner can do wonders. He will not indeed elicit falsehoods from an honest witness. But in relation to the total truth in the witness's mind, the structure of an examination is like a stencil. It determines how much of that truth will appear and what pattern it suggests. Nevertheless, I shall conclude now as Foucault does, in reflection of that novelty whose powers have been relegated to literature, which offers us only remnants of that discarded image. There is nothing now, either in our knowledge or in our reflection, that still recalls even the memory of that being. Nothing, except perhaps literature, and even then in a fashion more elusive and diagonal than direct. It may be said in a sense that literature, as it was constituted and so designated on the threshold of the modern age, manifests, at a time when it was least expected, the reappearance of the living being of language. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the peculiar existence and ancient solidity of language as a thing inscribed in the fabric of the world were dissolved in the functioning of representation. All language had value only as discourse. The art of language was a way of making a sign, of simultaneously signifying something and arranging signs around that thing. An art of naming, therefore, and then, by means of reduplication, both demonstrative and decorative, of capturing that name, of enclosing and concealing it, of designating it, in turn by other names that were the deferred presence of the first name. Its secondary sign, its figuration, its rhetorical panoply. And yet, through the 19th century, and right up to our own day, from Halgerin to Mallarmé and to Antoine Artaud, And yet, throughout the 19th century and right up to our own day, literature achieved autonomous existence and separated itself from all other language with a deep scission, only by forming a sort of counter discourse, and by finding its way back from the representative or signifying function of language to this raw being that had been forgotten since the 16th century. It is possible to believe that one has attained the very essence of literature, where one is no longer interrogating it at the level of what it says, but only in its significant form. In doing so, one is limiting one's view of language to its classical status. In the modern age, literature is that which compensates for, and not that which confirms, the signifying function of language. Through literature, the being of language shines once more on the frontiers of Western culture, and at its center, for it is what has been most foreign to that culture since the 16th century. But it has also, since the same century, been at the very center of what Western culture has overlain. This is why literature is appearing more and more as that which must be thought, but equally, and for the same reason, as that which can never, in any circumstance, be thought in accordance with a theory of signification. Whether one analyzes it from the point of view of what is signified, or what it is trying to say, of its ideas, of what it promises, or of what it commits one to, or from the point of view of what it signifies, with the help of paradigms borrowed from linguistics or psychoanalysis, matters little. All of this is merely incidental. In both cases, one would be searching for it outside the ground in which, as regards our culture, it has never ceased for the past century and a half to come into being and to imprint itself. Such modes of decipherment belong to a classical situation of language, the situation that predominated during the 17th century when the organizations of signs became binary, and when signification was reflected in the form of representation. For at that time, literature really was composed of a signifying element and a signified content, so that it was proper to analyze it accordingly. But from the 19th century, literature began to bring language back to light once more in its own being, though not as it still appeared at the end of the Renaissance. For now we no longer have that primary, that absolutely initial word upon which the infinite movement of discourse was founded and by which it was limited. Henceforth, language was to grow with no point of departure, no end, and no promise. It is the traversal of this futile yet fundamental space that the text of literature traces from day to day.